All right, so let's get started. So I am Russ Albright. I'm the founder and CEO of Crosslake, and have probably worked with many of you already. And then Kim, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Sure. Kim Wapter is one of the managing directors here at Crosslake. Been here for 5 years, and prior to that was Microsoft for 18 years, and financial firm before that. So 30 years in the industry, hands-on experience.
Awesome. Thanks, Kim. Look, this is really about, cost optimization, but I must talk at least a little bit about Crosslake. So again, most of you may already know us, but we do quite a lot of technical due diligence as well as value creation for insight companies, as well as we have probably roughly 100 other private equity companies we work for. We work exclusively or almost exclusively with private equity, growth equity, a little bit of venture capital, and then their portfolio companies. And we offer a variety of services, but it all revolves really around software. I mean, we're all software people, through and through. And our other claim to fame here is that all of our people are from industry, right? So they're not people that have grown up in the consulting world. They grew up basically shipping product and running IT systems. So jumping on this next slide, in the middle here is an example of some of the other insight companies we worked for in some form or another, whether it's tech diligence or value creation type projects. And off to the left is a sample of some of the other clients we work for, and then off to the right is a sample of some of the partnerships or affiliations we have. So we do some work with KPMG, we have a partnership with WhiteSource, as well as Black Duck and Amazon, and then we also have an affiliation with the Boston Consulting Group. So in any event, let's jump forward to the presentation today. So what we what you should expect to get out of this basically is Kim and I are going to basically share our learnings from our own personal experiences, as well as working with a variety of portfolio companies on how you can go out and basically drive sustainable cost improvement efforts to drive profitability. And the key word here is sustainability. It's really easy to go out and cut costs and then have to recoup those costs at some point later because you didn't do it the right way. So this is really all about how to do it sustainably. And what we're really going to cover is the journey, and again, our experiences, but the journey end to end in how you do that, providing basically a framework, talking through how you can avoid potential pitfalls in putting in a cost optimization or cost reduction effort. And a big message we want to send here is it's super important when you get in a situation where you need and must, like we're kind of in today, where you really need to think through, what your cost structure is. You really want to move fast, understand the situation, come up with a game plan and start doing implementation, but you don't want to rush into it and make mistakes that could really impact your long-term future. So move quickly, but don't rush. That's a famous John Wooden saying if you're a basketball fan. All right, so jumping forward, really the starting point here is really understanding what is the gap that you have in a business. So what is the cost shortfall that you need to make up for, and perhaps what's the gap in people that you need to make up for in being able to achieve your business goals. And so when you're thinking about what that gap is, you really need to think about, well, what are your market assumptions? So how bad is the situation? How clear is the situation? And so with COVID, I mean, if you go back 3 months ago as an example, pretty darn unclear what the impact was going to be. And I think now it's getting clearer and clearer for people what it looks like and how people need to react to it. And then you also need to think about your business strategy. Are you still in a growth mode? Are you more about reducing costs and improving the bottom line, or is it more of an integration play? And that really is important in thinking through the type of people you need to keep and what that gap looks like. And then also think about the exit goals, right? So if your plan is that we're trying to exit in 6 months, then you need to make sure that any improvements you're putting in place have an ROI within that 6-month period of time, or they don't really provide you a lot of value at exit. And then constraints is really understanding things like how sticky is the product, right? And the stickier the product is, the more you can get away with in changing the roadmap and taking actions, et cetera. And also, another common constraint is you've made a lot of customer commitments, and if you basically renege on those commitments, then you risk having retention problems, which further drives you into that hole and into that gap. So really, why is this important? Well, it's important that everybody in the executive team gets together and align to this. We've got a common message that's going out to the team, and everybody's singing the same song on why it's important that we're doing this, why we're taking these actions, what's our philosophy, and that as you do the cost reduction, that they're aligned. And so we had one instance as an example as we were going in, where we had the product and tech team cutting a feature that the sales and marketing team was actually ramping up to sell, and so, basically you had a situation where you were spending money getting ramped up to sell it, and you're also losing revenue because you cut the wrong thing. So being aligned is really critical. Okay. So keep jumping forward. So now we've got the gap identified. How do we close the gap that we need to fill, both in cost and in people? And really, when I think about it, there's 3 big buckets of things that we can go through and tackle. And the first one is really around product rationalization and looking at our roadmap and understanding where we're spending money and what's the value of those kind of things. And we can typically get pretty fast ROI on those things. Within the first 1 to 3 months, we can start getting a return. And then the next bucket is really around cost reduction. So this is going out and basically cutting spend or stopping spend, et cetera. And again, you can get a pretty fast return on investment from those things, anywhere from 1 to 3 months. So the next bucket is development productivity. And quite honestly, this is one where it's typically you're getting the best return on investment over time and the best opportunity, but it takes longer to see that return. So it typically takes 3 to 9 months or so to basically start seeing the return on investment from these type of improvement opportunities. All right, so when we're thinking about how you tackle this, basically, you really think about starting with what's over to the left here, and you're thinking about things that really require lower investment to get the return, lower risk to get that return. And so starting to this left is where you start thinking about stopping, low value work. And as an example, if you've got things on the product roadmap that aren't providing a lot of return, then those are things that are fairly easy to go out and analyze, get agreement, and cut. And then getting into things like your, renegotiating costs. I mean, this is something you can do at any time. It's relatively low risk, and fairly easy to do. And then removing low performers. Again, this is something you should be doing on a regular basis anyway, to improve your business. And then as you get into the things here like increasing work efficiency, leveraging lower cost resources, this is something that typically takes more energy, time, effort to get to this kind of return. So those are the areas that we typically talk about and we'll break down. I'll cover product rationalization, cost reduction, and Kim will jump into development productivity. Okay, so product rationalization, what we encourage people to do is jump in quickly and really look at the portfolio, look at the product roadmap. And the kind of things you do are start by understanding where is this product in its life cycle. So in this little table to the bottom here, you can see we've looked at, they've got 4 different products, and we've identified the stage of the product. So this first one is in a growth mode, is an example. And we've come up with target spend. So we should spend, it's pretty normal, spend 20%, maybe even higher for a growth mode product. They're actually spending 15%, so they're underspending on this particular product. But then you start looking at the next product, more of a balanced spend. It should be at about 15% or less, and they're actually spending 18%. So now we've got an opportunity to basically right-size the investment in that and take a look at it. So as you go through all of these, and this is a real world example, but as we go through all of these, we basically come up with, we're really spending about 2.2 million more than we should on this portfolio of products. So we should be looking at how fast we can reduce the spend. Will there be any impact on retention or customer commitments that we have to focus on? So once we decide what the level of spend is, then we can start going through the roadmap and look at the stack rank and make sure that we've got the things that have the highest business impact on the top of the list, and that's what the development team is working on. And we also may have new opportunities that provide competitive advantage that we want to accelerate during a time period like this, that we'd want to also get up to the top of the list. So as an example, we had a company that we were working with that provided restaurant software. And of course, restaurant software right now is not the most popular, but they had on their roadmap for about a year out to create a takeaway application or module as part of this. And so they accelerated that and got it done, within the first month. And actually they increased their revenue going through this cycle, because basically every restaurant that wants to stay in business right now needs to have a takeaway application. So anyway, that's what they did. And the other thing we really encourage people to do is make sure you're carving out some of the budget to work on quick return, quick hit ROI productivity improvement. So allocate about somewhere between 5 and 10% to really thinking through how you can reinvest it and get a quick return. And then last but not least is that I can bet that most of the portfolio companies, they're going to have some projects that are more pet projects and the value's unclear. And so you got to take a real critical look at those, and just, if they don't have obvious value, just stop them, right? And free up that funds to put into some other area of the company. Alrighty. So that's product rationalization, quick framework to look at. So the next thing that I think about, again, this is kind of easy cost reduction efforts. And, the reality is that you can go after these pretty fast and little risk to the business, but it's not likely going to be enough to solve your entire cost gap, but it's a good thing to look at. So common areas that we encourage people to look at is look at your cloud spend, and there's a lot of things you can do here. If you're on something like AWS, do a well-architected review, do a cost analysis. I can almost guarantee you're going to find areas to free up funds in that by switching license types, reserved instances, things like that, or just underutilized environments that people are running, but we're not really getting the value out of those. So pretty common to have QA type environments or dev environments that are spinning and not being used effectively. The next area is freezing spend. So this is really looking at open recs, longer term contracts, any new contracts, and just put them on hold, right? So you can put these on hold, and you can always unfreeze them if you find that the situation isn't as bad as you expected, or as you decide to prioritize a particular initiative. Next one, reduce or eliminate lazy spend. And really what we mean by lazy spend is you start getting things that get charged to credit cards. Nobody looks at these expenses, or you have subscriptions that people aren't using effectively. And some of these subscriptions can get really expensive. So, recruiting subscriptions on LinkedIn are quite expensive. So if people aren't using them effectively, or you're not recruiting, those are good things to look at, reducing for the future. Postpone non-revenue oriented projects. So The trick here could be that these are good productivity projects too, so you have to be kind of careful. But again, you can thaw them back out, unfreeze them if you find you have the funds. But the thing I typically talk to people about on things like this is that if it's a quick return, keep them going. If it's something that's going to take a longer period of time to get that return and a pretty significant upfront investment, postpone it and then thaw it out when you feel more comfortable funding that particular project. All right. So the last big bucket in cost reduction, and these can be painful, but it may be necessary for your business to take a look at doing this, is thinking about how you're going to do basically a reduction in force. And the reality with technology people, they're in high demand. It's hard to build a good team. You don't want to lose them when you get them. So we really encourage people to think step one about where can you redeploy your tech talent to other holes in the organization. So you may have gaps, as an example, in sales engineering, where they could be building prototypes to help you sell more, or maybe in customer service, you may have gaps you can't fill, so you can redeploy them over to there. So you're kind of killing two birds with one stone. One is you're keeping your best talent, and two is you're actually giving them opportunities in other parts of the business where they can add more value. The next one that you can do, and again, you should be doing this one anyway, is look at a targeted reduction in force. So this is looking at people that, you know, are at the bottom of your stack rank. They're not performing that great. They're not adding that much value to the company. You should be, you know, reviewing those on a regular basis anyway and moving those people out. So in this little table, we use that example of redeploy and target a reduction, and that gives us an estimated reduction of about 1.2, and we need a remaining, or we have a remaining gap of about 1.8. So now we got to look at other options to get the rest. So now we're starting to cut in, or we don't really want to, but we still have to do it. So what are our options? And where we kind of think about it is like, there's three options, or a combination. Is one is do a company-wide reduction. This is where everybody shares the pain. So if you got a great team, they're really well bonded, you don't want to lose any of these people. This is a great way to get people to come together and share the pain. So this could look like, you know, taking people down 10%, maybe 20%, deferring bonuses, benefit reductions, things like that. But everybody gets to keep their job as part of this. And then when things stabilize or get better, you can start returning those monies to people. So EMC is an example. Big company did this back in 2008, where they surveyed their people, and the majority of people said they'd rather you know, share the impact that rather than having people laid off from the organization. Furloughs is another good option. So again, if you have people you want to keep, you can't afford them, you want to be able to bring them back as soon as you can put them on a furlough. And so you can at least, you know, bring those folks back in, you know, as soon as possible. And then the last is really, and again, if you have to do it, is do a reduction in force. But now you're getting into depth. And when you're thinking about this, again, you should follow the same pattern you do for lower performers, where you're looking at people that are still on closer to the bottom of the stack rank, either as individuals, or maybe you can look at teams that are underperforming. So the entire team, you can remove it, or maybe there's a particular development center that just isn't performing up to, you know, where you really want it to be. So those are good targets to think about to get to the cost result you need and minimize the impact on the organization. So back to the business strategy, when you're thinking about who are your stack rank performers, you got to think about who best fits where you want to go with the business. So if you've changed your direction a bit and you're going from high growth mode to, you know, really we need to be more about operational excellence, you want to make sure that you're picking and retaining the people that are really good at improving operational focus and driving down cost of development. If you're in the growth mode, it may be more important to have people that are really good at innovation and getting new ideas out fast, but aren't necessarily the most operationally excellent. So you got to think about your strategy and line that up to your headcount decisions. All right, so before I switch over to Kim, a few lessons learned when you're going through this cost reduction piece of the puzzle is don't get emotional about it, right? I mean, you've got to be the rock for your organization and basically show people the path forward. Make sure you're thinking about the long term so you're not damaging the long-term capability of the company. The other thing we really encourage people to do is just rip off the Band-Aid. Do this once, right? And there's nothing worse than doing a reduction, 3 months later doing another reduction, 3 months later doing another reduction. You really end up losing your best people. They go other places. And so again, rip it off, do it once, go deep. And then the other thing is just be really open and honest with your communication, right? People really appreciate it. They don't appreciate people soft pedaling bad news, right? They want it straight and just be open and honest. And then last but not least, super important as you go through this, you've got to re-recruit your key talent. And the last thing you want to do is end up losing your best people as you go through a process like this, which really drives you further into the hole. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kim, and she will talk through productivity.
Great, and thank you, Russ, for that, and the great segue here. So again, it's really about making sure that once you have these initiatives, we can actually baseline those and measure the improvements. And if it's not working, we need to cut it. So the Agile approach provides a good framework for implementing any initiatives you come up with. And the goal is to really figure out what those gaps are and close them in a very iterative way. And even if the leadership team you're not working with doesn't do sprints or doesn't do Agile, it's a great time to start because it's a good framework for this. So you want to move quickly to get those ideas fleshed out, prioritize, and actually put onto your backlog. So they should be just part of your normal work. So whether a person's working on a feature or whether someone's working on a cost optimization initiative, it needs to be back on your backlog, assigned to milestone, assigned to owners. And then you need to measure those. Make sure we're validating those results. If we're not getting the results we want, let's tweak it, let's change it, let's cut it, let's do some action. Do not let it continue as is. Some results will come quickly, as we've seen. Some are really immediate, short-term ones. And we'll talk about some longer-term ones where, those may be a little bit more painful to see, but in the end, they'll pay off. So again, this is a fairly standard approach to drive continuous improvement, and we'll dive into this next couple of specific areas in the next slides. So here are some examples of some of those different activities we can conduct using this model in a pretty low cost way. So, it doesn't need to be this full-fledged engagement with Crosslake. It really can be something pretty quick. So some examples here, we've done some workshops for some leadership teams and taking folks through a half-day workshop, and where Russ mentioned earlier some of these things like understanding the market assumptions, understanding financial goals, business strategy, constraints. It's really about our job as facilitation and getting folks on the same page and seeing where some of those gaps are, where some of those initiatives can lie from the leadership activity. The other thing is we've done is conduct a brainstorming session and exercise. And Russ, if you build up this slide, this will show some examples here for you. Where the brainstorming sessions, we can tailor these to the organization, and we can do this in person or we can do this online as part of a survey. And what's nice about this, we'll ask some really detailed questions about your engineering activities, and they could be deep upon release planning, to the way you do development, to the way you do deployment and operation. So it really is tailored to where you see some problems. And we baseline that. And what's great about getting a baseline, first of all, it provides us with some real scores to compare against one another. But many times we'll base this along the lines of having the baseline done with separate teams. Some teams could be like, let's baseline, one feature group with another feature group to see if there's any best practice we can leverage across the different teams. Sometimes we actually do it between the leadership and the ICs, the individual contributors, and we find some interesting gaps and deltas there. And we find areas where maybe there's a communication issue, and we think that we're doing, for example, code reviews all the time, and we find out from the team they're actually never doing it, and maybe that's leading to some code quality issues down the line. So by kind of guiding the teams through these brainstorming sessions, we can present a backlog of items. The other things here is the spreadsheet's a little bit small, but what we do is, because our team is full of practitioners like myself, we come from companies where we've been engineering managers, been developers, been operations staff. We know how to get things done, and we know some of the plague problems. So the results we provide, and this is kind of a kudos to we get from our clients, is that we really give matter of fact recommendations that people can implement right away. It's not consultant speak. It's very genuine feedback that you can put in your backlog and actually incorporate all the time on a daily basis. And really what we also do is weight that by different values. So if you're interested in quality, for example, you can sort those recommendations on a quality vector. Introducing productivity metrics. If that's something that you want to be aware of, you can sort on that. Also, we have a metric for cost. So again, these different outputs of results and recommendations we feed to the team are very much ones that you guys can incorporate and put on to the client's backlog as well. So the other thing we want to really make sure is we can measure people's success. So whether those ideas come up organically, or we have some kind of process to take them through our funnel, make sure they're vetted out, make sure we understand that ROI, understand the baseline, and then mark those improvements. So again, fleshing this out further, we'll take this to a transformational roadmap. So on the next slide, I just provided some areas where we had some unexpected gains by doing these simple exercises. So again, this is not a full, weeks, months of engagements. These are short activities that we utilize to present some really unexpected gains. So Russ talked about the portfolio workshop we do, where we basically sit down with the leadership team to understand, the product portfolio, where the products are going, are they in growth mode, sustain mode, et cetera. We did a quick workshop where we found, we had a bunch of products that were really in sunset mode, but ironically, we found that there's a lot of more people that we actually didn't know that were actually working on these sunsetted projects. So just simply by allocating those resources to more innovation work, to more growth setting work, we freed about 15% of the R&D staff up to do this. We actually took it to a second level too, where we said, okay, let's actually longer term move some of these maintenance projects to the offshore resources. So move them to lower cost resources. So again, we haven't seen the results of that ROI, but we now have a baseline where we can see how that will reduce costs over time as that offshore site gets set up and we hire individuals there. Regarding a baseline metrics, we just introduced that survey I showed before, where we thought we had consistent agile practices across the team. And what we found is by digging down to the team, they said that, their dashboards and metrics that they were producing on a monthly basis for the management team was not automated. They were spending several hours a week and months creating these dashboards for the executive team. Well, funny enough, the leadership team thought these were automatic processes and they were just getting this for free. So they were shocked to find out the team was absorbing about 10 hours a week per team on getting these metrics. So a simple thing like that. So we level set and said, okay, well, what set of KPIs and metrics do you need? What do we get out of Jira automatically? And then, making sure we had the right inputs so the team no longer had to create these crazy dashboards every month for management. Again, a short, small time saving, but again, we saw a disalignment between leadership and ICs. Another recent project we worked on is we have an open source project that we work on, a funded development effort that's sponsored by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Because it's open source as community development, we actually have a lot of folks working on it, and we have several folks spinning up resources, and it's not always direct accountability for who's doing what because it's a big platform. So we said, how do we introduce tagging as a way to keep costs under control? So we introduced an AWS tagging methodology. So we have a system set up that before anybody spins up a resource, they have to sign it a cost tag. And we do weekly reports of this to make sure we understand where the costs are coming from. And as a result, I think Russ mentioned this earlier, we found people were spinning up QA environments and then not needing them, so they go idle, but we still get be charged for them. We're spinning up a performance environment for some non-functional tests and they leave it intact. So just as a result of that, we were able to reduce costs by $6K a month just by identifying unused resources. And again, $6K is not enough, but for an open source project, that was almost half of our budget. So it was significant. Another area where we can help it is root cause analysis. And I think people are really good at understanding kind of problems, but sometimes they don't have the time or the understanding how to really get to that root cause. So again, a quick couple sessions, 3 or 4 hours, we use techniques like the 5 whys and other methodologies to really understand what the root cause analysis is of issues and then put in that action plan. So on this particular example, we worked with customer support and the engineering team to really dive into the last outages over the last couple of months, the last KB, the articles, the issues coming in, and really understand what was causing the top user problems. So by putting together kind of some helpful tips in their online sharing for customers, and then implementing a longer term kind of automation for some of their password resets and some of the other common issues, we were able to kind of decrease the call volume. And again, this has happened over about 3 or 4 weeks to about 20% of the original volume. Again, that could lead to further decreation of staff and cost cuts as we play this out. So those are just some examples. And what I like about these examples, obviously these are real world examples that we've done, but these didn't take that long. The investment of time was maybe 4 or 5 hours from the client, if that, sometimes even 2 hours. And the turnaround results were seen quite quickly. So I thought that was nice to share. On the next slide, this just talks about a transformational roadmap. So the idea is once you have these initiatives tagged, right, and figure out what you're going to do. And, one of the things that we didn't mention, but I'll mention now is that it's really critical not to take on too much, right? That's the other thing we're sometimes playing with is this multitasking world. Pick the top, 2 to 3 things, do them and do them well, and try to do one at a time. And again, if you're pretty specific about what you want to do, it's easier to put your concentration in it, have the team focus on it, make sure you're baselining the initial the estimate, and then understanding the result. So a lot of times we do this is we perhaps set up this kind of a governance and execution committee. And it's really about making sure that we track each initiative separately as a discrete item, and we have monthly checkpoints. So we don't just give it over to Bob to execute on and it kind of goes by the wayside, but we're actually allocating resources to drive these initiatives. We're driving to checkpoints and metrics, and we're actually integrating that with the current work. Too many times when these special initiatives come up, you put it to Bob, but Bob already has a full plate. We need to put something off of Bob's plate to make sure this gets done. Because if not, and if it's not assigned a priority, then it's going to fall by the wayside. So it's really critical that we have some kind of body of folks comprised from the organization that is really in charge of monitoring these initiatives, making sure people have bandwidth, and making sure that we have those monthly checkpoints and metrics in place to see if it's not going well. And when it's not going well, we need to address it. We can't just let it continue going. We should cut it and move on. So that's kind of the areas that I wanted to talk about in this slide.
And just to add one point to what Kim was talking about here is that when we have these operational improvements that we want to implement, from our perspective, it's really important that they get integrated in with the product roadmap and prioritized with your other backlog items. So it's part of what you're doing on a regular basis as opposed to a separate initiative. And the challenge, if it's a separate initiative, it's the first thing that people drop or forget about, or, it's extra overhead to basically manage it. But if you build it into your normal development process, it just becomes part of what you do, and you just allocate some time to it, get it done, you handle it. You've got acceptance criteria just like you would for any other user story or defect that you're fixing, etc. So it just makes it a lot easier to drive the improvements as well as drive for continuous improvement.
Great. Thank you for the addition. So the next slide, again, these are really buckets, but it's not the fast and hard rule here. There's certain things that you're going to see that are pretty short term. And some of the examples I gave on the slide a couple slides ago were really short term quick wins, right? We saw the return on investment rather quick. So, resource alignment to other priorities, that's something you should be able to do. One of the things I'll note is sometimes, the portfolio is so complex, people really don't have a good understanding where their resources are spending their time. So one of the things that's kind of exciting is we've been partnering with some third-party teams that are helping teams understand how allocation of resources and distributive work actually goes on. And we have some partners that we're piloting out that will actually do analysis on the number of code check-ins, the number of stories, and we can marry that with some of the information we get, with that anecdotal information or quantitative information that we get for some of these sessions, and really highlight some of the areas where we can illuminate people are actually spending their time. So back to kind of, that analysis, we found a lot of people were actually working on, a project that was supposed to be sunsetted. We found that because looking at the code reviews and seeing the check-ins, that number was, abnormally high. So it's not always apparent by looking at Jira or your ticketing system where folks are spending their time. So coupling some of our analysis work with some of these tools, are yielding great results in our pilots as well. So the other thing, as Russ mentioned, looking at your contracts, modifying those, postponing some non-revenue generating projects, that's pretty easy wins as well. The streamlining of cloud spend, you could do that immediately. And again, we have some really great folks on the team that have done cost-cutting measures for both AWS and Azure as well. So we have great tips in that perspective. From a midterm standpoint, again, ROI is a little bit further down the line, but this is where it gets to like productivity and automation efforts. For example, we might find as a result of our survey, we're spending a lot of time on manual testing. So what do we do about that? We have facilities and resources that we can actually beef up automation testing, right? Just implementing a tool to track your manual test cases, seeing how we can improve things there. Implement procedures for automation and CI/CD. So all that, sometimes you have to spend a little money to see the cost benefits and see the productivity long term. But again, that's why having that baseline and ROI will show the return over time. The other thing is about tech debt and maintenance. So people sometimes say, oh, we don't need to address tech debt, but the longer you postpone the tech debt, the bigger the cost maintenance, the bigger the issue it is. It gets harder and harder to add new features when you have a product of spaghetti code or you have a product that is very fickle. So addressing that proactively makes it much easier to build on top of it in the future. So those are kind of the 6 month bucket. And then of course we have, longer term buckets. And yeah, I probably should have thrown some of the automation in there where you really realize the game. But some of the other things is like the architecture and modernization. A lot of people are figuring out, how do we take this monolithic application and move it to be more to the cloud? Well, if you do it wrong, it actually could be a lot more costly if you do it wrong. So having the right folks that have actually been through this before, know how to design a system for low cost, low maintenance solutions in the cloud, using the latest and greatest technology, depending on your cloud of choice, spending that time up front to do that, is well worth your benefit, because if it's not done properly, then again, it could cost more maintenance and more costs in the future as well. So again, the ROI really spans kind of the gamut on when you can do it, but it's about exercising that muscle now and getting folks used to, incremental change and keeping them up to date and abreast of all the things you're doing and making sure that you're transparent through this time. So with that, change. So no one really likes change, but it is inevitable. It can be voluntary or imposed. And it can take place on a number of different levels, right? It could be an organizational level, could be an individual, it could be a global, like we're seeing right now, or it could be, localized. But these changes require specific conceptual areas for you guys to think about. So it's not just about implementing a change and then just throwing it out there. It's really about thinking about how this change impacts things like the people's values, people's beliefs, people's behaviors. So we like to kind of snap to the Costner model change. And there's really 5 elements that we found, and obviously he did, effective for making these change. And they're on the lines of having the right vision. So does this vision make sense? Does it agree with all the parameters we set out in the beginning, right? Do we have the right skills on our team to execute on this vision, right? Sometimes we need to bring in new resources, consultants. We might be able to put some new hires on this. Do we have the right incentives? Do people feel like this is a good thing? Are we giving folks the right reason, whether they're excited to do this new technology or excited to learn this new feature, the right incentives in place? And they're not always monetary. We found that at some point, our developers, when I was working at Microsoft, to get morale up, giving them big screen monitors was a much more effective tactic for getting them excited about something versus a bump in pay. Do we have the right resources? So this goes back to my comment as well as Russ. It's not just, figuring out who's going to do it, but making sure they have the necessary time on their plate and make sure that we're tracking that work into the backlog. And then finally, making sure we have that action plan, right? We need to have that plan that clearly articulates, what this incentive is, how it's going to be measured, what are the target milestones, what are the metrics in place. So without that plan, again, we'll have unsuccessful changes either way. So I think this is a good model to help people plan and diagnose what might be happening when things don't go our way. Okay. We can move to the next slide.
Yeah, and just to add just a quick 2 cents on it, I think if you look at the different things on here, these are the perfect examples of what go wrong when you're trying to improve how you do product development. And using a model like this just helps you avoid a lot of pain and basically being able to identify those areas that are going to go wrong and mitigate them. So we love this model. We think it's super effective.
And then just moving on to the timeline, depending on the size and complexity, as much as possible, we want to move more quickly. And our goal should be to shift those timelines to the left as possible, right? When to start now. And you expect you will continue to iterate and refactor as your plans in the situation becomes more clear, right? Example, the depth of the market condition. Example, how this world is going to adjust to the new normal. And again, as just a reminder, we don't want to move quick and don't rush into rash decisions. And I think of it as more, there's 2 decision types, right? There are decisions that are not reversible. So you have to be very careful about making them. And those are just like, obviously laying off your workforce. They might be, but typically they're not, right? And there's other decisions like walking through a door where you can always go back. So make sure you understand what type of decision you're going to be making and actually make it and move forward. So again, here's some of the goals here for the months laid out, and you making sure that we have that governance process in place, we have those weekly and monthly checkpoints in place, and we're continuing to evaluate along the lines.
And just so I'm actually instead of covering this, I think what we've got here is some of the most common pitfalls and how to think about mitigating these. We've talked about some of these as we've gone through, so in the sake of time we won't go through each of these, but at least the ones that I think are super important to point out is, one, make sure you're paying attention to your customer and attrition level or attrition risk. Is the reality, if you're starting to take action that is impacting your customer attrition, you're further driving yourself in a hole. So it's kind of, like that iterative destruction process. So having the right messaging, making sure you've got the right backlog items and people are focused on the right priorities is critical. And then the other one, again, I would call out is, as you're going through these kind of processes, make sure that you're focused on keeping your morale high and open communication. And so again, trying to avoid having multiple waves of cost reduction, that just really, if you do that, it really demoralizes the team by having those waves. When's the next shoe going to drop, basically. Again, keep re-recruiting the top talent on the team or your team, and then just be open and honest of where things are. And again, have a hard message up front, and you can always back off on that message, you know, as things get clearer or better. So anyway, with that said, I just wanted to open to QA and you know, open discussion in these few minutes we have left. Excuse me.
Thank you so much. And if everyone would kindly enter some questions in the Q&A module, you should be enter your question there. I noticed someone just raised their hand, but feel free to enter your question in the Q&A chat and I'll read it off.
Well, okay, great question. So we've got a question that basically asks, when you're building out a new process, how do we think about ROI versus investment time? And yeah, good question. So look, I think about it personally in a very agile way, and so trying to use things off the shelf is a perfect example to keep the cost of that lower. Is one attribute of it. And then the other attribute is you're implementing these things, do it one step at a time. So you're keeping the risk low, the cost low, you're getting more immediate benefit from that. And then, you know, overall, when I think of ROI and the time you're putting into that process versus something else you could be doing, I think about it in basically the same way. You're implementing a process, you're expecting it to have a business goal of reducing costs or helping you improve revenue or whatever it may be. And then you got to compare that to some other investment you may make or some feature that you may be developing and basically match it up to that ROI. And it should be stack ranked on the backlog based on that ROI or business impact, regardless of whether it's an internal improvement or whether it's an external feature. So anyway, Kim, anything you have to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think you summed it up good. And well, as far as, you know, it's about measuring it, right? Like I said, it's hard to put numbers to certain things, but as much as possible, put the swag to them. And, you know, even we did this when, you know, we invested a couple hours for a leadership workshop. We identified, you know, some areas of products that we wanted to sunset. And then we just took those teams and reallocated. It was, you know, like 5 to 10 hours of work in total. And, you know, we had 15% of our workforce now assigned to new innovation. That seems like a really great trade-off. So I think just assigning some level of metric, whether you're going to do something and start small is usually a good place.
Okay, hopefully that answered that question. More questions? While we're waiting for people to think about questions, one thing I wanted to mention here is that we also offer up or one way that you can look at your AWS spend is do a well-architected review, or WAR for short. And this is funded by AWS basically, and we offer this service, but basically it ends up being a net zero cost. And you're looking through and identifying operational excellence, security, reliability, performance, and cost optimization. And so these things almost always find some pretty significant cost savings, as well as security issues, etc. So you know, would love to offer this up and for you all to take advantage of that. Okay, let's see if I have more questions. Okay.
So, yeah, if no one has any other questions, as I mentioned earlier, we will be sharing an email with the deck, the recording, as well as some additional resources and a link to Crosslake's the partner profile on the Go Network. So keep a lookout for that email. And thank you so much, Russ and Kim. This is wonderful. We really appreciate your time.
Great. Thank you all.
Thank
Have
you.
a wonderful day, everyone. Thank you.
All right. Cheers.